The coffin was white, the flowers were lilies, and I was standing at the front of that church holding the hand of a 4-year-old boy who thought I was his father. 200 people filled those pews. Business partners, family lawyers, old friends of the Hargrove name, all of them watching me, the nobody, standing beside Serena Hargrove like I belonged there. She was draped in black, her face a perfect portrait of grief, one hand pressed to her chest, tears sliding down her cheeks in slow, photogenic lines. Everyone believed her. I believed her. I had believed her for 8 months. Leo squeezed my fingers. He was too young to understand death, too young to understand funerals, too young to understand why so many grown adults kept staring at him with those careful, practiced expressions of sorrow. He just knew that I was there, and that as long as I was there, everything was going to be fine. That was the deal. Unspoken, stitched together somewhere between his first nightmare and the 100th bedtime story. I was his anchor. I had agreed to be. The priest was mid-sentence when it happened. The church doors opened. Not slowly, not gently. They opened the way a man opens a door when he owns the room behind it, with complete, unhurried certainty. A figure stepped through. Tall, dark coat, unbothered by the 200 faces that turned toward him like a single tide. Elliot Hargrove was supposed to be in that coffin. He was not in that coffin. He walked down the center aisle like a man returning from a business trip, not a man returning from the dead. The gasps broke across the room in a slow wave. First the people near the back, then the middle rows, then finally the family section, where an elderly man in a gray suit half rose from his seat and grabbed the pew in front of him to stay upright. I did not gasp. I did not move. I looked at Serena. She had gone perfectly still, not frozen with shock. Still. The kind of still that belongs to someone who has been waiting for a moment and is now watching it arrive exactly on schedule. There was no surprise in her eyes. There was something else. Something that lived in the space between relief and guilt. And in the 3 seconds it took me to read her face, 8 months of my life quietly rearranged itself into something I did not recognize. Leo tugged my sleeve. His small voice cut through the silence of 200 held breaths. "Daddy," he whispered, looking up at me with those wide, serious eyes. "Who is that man?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. For a moment, nobody moved. It should have ended there, with me setting the boy down, walking out of that church, and never looking back. But it didn't.
And the reason it didn't begins 8 months earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon on the 14th floor of a half-finished building in downtown Chicago, where a woman I had never met watched me sprint into traffic to stop her son from getting hit by a car, and decided, in that moment, that I was exactly what she needed. If you've ever been chosen by the wrong person for the right reasons, then you already know how this goes. If you haven't, stay with me. Because what happened next is something I'm still learning how to explain. Subscribe and don't move. The story is just getting started. My name is Ethan Cole. I am 29 years old. I own a drafting table, a coffee maker, and exactly one good suit that I wore to job interviews and funerals. And until 8 months ago, I had only ever needed it for interviews. I grew up in the foster system. Not the kind you see in movies, where there is one defining trauma and one defining hero. The real kind. Quiet, institutional, forgettable. Family to family, city to city. Never long enough anywhere to leave a mark or have one left on me. By the time I aged out at 18, I had learned one thing with absolute certainty. Nobody chooses you twice. They choose you when you are useful, and they move on when you are not. I told myself that was fine. I built my life around that truth like a man builds a house on flood ground. Carefully,
and with full knowledge that it would not last. I became an architect because I liked the idea of designing spaces where people could stay. I was decent at it. Not brilliant, not connected, not the kind of person who gets noticed in a room full of Hargroves. I was the kind of person who showed up on time, did the work, and went home alone. That Tuesday in October, I was doing a walkthrough inspection on a Hargrove property development on Michigan Avenue. 14th floor, open framework, cold wind coming off the lake. I was checking load-bearing measurements when I heard the commotion below. A child's voice, a woman's sharp inhale, the specific sound of small feet moving somewhere they absolutely should not be. I did not think. I moved. By the time I reached the street, Leo was already 3 steps into the lane. A delivery truck was coming around the corner. I crossed the distance between us in 4 seconds and pulled him back onto the curb with about half a second to spare. The truck horn blared. My heart was somewhere behind my teeth. Leo looked up at me with enormous dark eyes. He did not cry. He just stared at me like I was the most interesting thing he had ever seen. Behind him, Serena Hargrove stood frozen on the sidewalk, her hand still outstretched from where she had tried to reach him. She was composed in the way that only people with real money learn to be composed. Completely, even in crisis. But her hands were shaking. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that." I looked down at Leo, who was still studying my face like a puzzle he intended to solve. "Someone had to," I said. And just like that, without either of us knowing it, something began. She called me 3 days later, not to thank me, to offer me a job. The terms were simple on the surface, or at least that is how she presented them. She needed someone to oversee the interior renovation on the Hargrove estate while she managed the legal battle over her late husband's assets. The position came with a private room, a salary that was double my current rate, and one additional condition she mentioned almost as an afterthought. She needed someone present for Leo while she handled the estate proceedings. The lawyers, she explained, had raised concerns about her capacity as a single mother. Having a stable, consistent male presence in the household would strengthen her position in court. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed until they no longer sound rehearsed. I said yes. I told myself it was the salary. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things that first week. What I did not tell myself, because I was not ready to say it out loud, was that Leo had looked at me on that sidewalk like nobody had ever looked at me before. Like I was someone who stayed. The first 30 days were professional. I managed the contractors, reviewed the renovation timelines, ate dinner in the kitchen while Serena took calls in her office. Leo ate with me. He was quiet at first, watchful, the way children are when they are deciding whether to trust someone. On day 11, he pushed his plate toward me and pointed at my food. On day 19, he fell asleep on the couch beside me while I was reviewing blueprints. On day 26, he had his first nightmare, and when I heard him crying at 2 in the morning and went to check, he grabbed my sleeve and would not let go until sunrise. By day 30, I had stopped counting. Serena noticed. I could feel her watching sometimes, not warmly, not coldly, but with the precise, measuring attention of someone calculating the value of an asset. I mistook it for something softer. That was my second mistake. My first had been signing the temporary legal guardianship form she slid across the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening without telling me what it actually contained. She said it was standard, a household formality for the court filing. I signed it without reading the full terms. She filed it the next morning. And somewhere in that estate, behind a door I had not yet thought to question, the real shape of everything she had planned was already waiting to be found. If you already see where this is going, you're not wrong. Subscribe and stay. The locked room changes everything. There are moments in a person's life that split cleanly into before and after. Not the loud moments, not the arguments, not the slammed doors, not the things people say when they want to wound you. The quiet ones. The ones where you open a door that was left unlocked by accident and stand in the frame, reading words that were never meant for your eyes, and feel the entire architecture of the last 8 months collapse silently around you like a building that forgot it was supposed to stay standing. That was a Thursday, 3 weeks before the funeral. Serena had told me Elliot died in a private plane crash somewhere over the Atlantic. No body recovered. She had delivered the news in the sitting room, her voice measured, her posture straight, her grief carefully proportioned. Enough to be believable, not enough to be inconvenient. I held her hand. I told her Leo would be okay. I meant it. I had no reason not to mean it.
2 weeks later, Leo woke up screaming at 2 in the morning. I went to him the way I always did, quickly, quietly, sitting on the edge of his bed until his breathing slowed. He grabbed my arm in the dark and said, "Daddy, don't let the other man take me." I told him it was just a dream. I smoothed his hair back and stayed until he fell asleep. I did not ask who the other man was. I told myself it did not matter. It mattered. The locked room had been locked for the entire 8 months I had lived in that estate. I had noticed it the first week and mentioned it once. Serena told me it was storage. I did not press. 3 days before the funeral, I walked past it on my way to the kitchen at midnight and found the door sitting open. Not wide, just slightly, the way a door sits when someone forgot to pull it fully shut behind them. I stopped. I stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then I pushed it open. It was not a storage room. It was an office. Monitors, filing cabinets, a mahogany desk with documents stacked in clean, organized columns. The kind of room that belongs to someone who plans things carefully and keeps records of those plans. I walked to the desk slowly, the way you approach something you already suspect is going to change you. The top document was a printed email chain. The sender was Elliot Hargrove. The date was 6 weeks ago, 2 weeks before Serena told me he was dead. He was writing from Zurich. I read the chain from the bottom up. It took 4 minutes. By the end of those 4 minutes, I understood that the plane crash was fabricated, that a federal fraud investigation had forced Elliot to disappear before charges were filed, that Serena had orchestrated the cover story, and that the funeral, the white coffin, the lilies, the 200 grieving guests, had been scheduled not to mourn a dead man, but to establish a legal paper trail that would protect his assets while he waited for the investigation to close. I set that document down. I picked up the next one. It was a memo from Serena's attorney. It outlined how the guardianship form I had signed gave Leo a stable household profile that shielded Serena from a custody challenge during the estate freeze. My signature. My name. Used like a tool that had been selected for a specific job and would be returned to the drawer when the job was finished. I set that one down too. At the bottom of the stack was a single handwritten note. Serena's handwriting. I recognized the precise, unhurried cursive from grocery lists and contractor notes. At the top of the page, underlined, were the words, Phase Plan. Beneath that, 3 lines. Phase 1. Find someone Leo bonds with. Phase 2. Establish legal presence. Phase 3. Elliot returns after investigation clears. My name was not on that note. I was not a person in her plan. I was a phase. A warm, willing, convenient phase that had shown up at exactly the right moment and asked so few questions that I must have seemed almost designed for the purpose. I stood in that room for a long time without moving. Leo's crayon drawings were taped to the wall beside the desk. Houses, stick figures, a tall person with the word Daddy written beside it with an arrow. I looked at that drawing and felt something I still do not have the right word for. Not anger, not grief. Something older than both of those. Something that lived in the part of me that had always known, on some foundational level, that this was how it ended. With me standing in a room realizing I had been chosen for what I could provide,
not for who I was. I put every document back exactly as I found it. I closed the door. I walked to Leo's room and sat in the chair beside his bed and watched him sleep until morning came. The funeral was in 48 hours. I already knew what I was going to do. I want to tell you that I had a plan. Something sharp and precise and satisfying. The kind of revenge that looks effortless because it was built carefully in the dark. But the truth is simpler and less cinematic than that. I walked into that funeral with the documents in my inside jacket pocket and no decision made. I was still deciding when the doors opened and Elliot Hargrove walked back from the dead. And then Leo asked me who that man was. And the decision made itself.
Elliot moved down the aisle with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed this entrance. The prodigal return, the dramatic resurrection, the moment everyone would remember. He was looking at Serena. He was not looking at Leo. His own son was standing 4 feet in front of him, and Elliot Hargrove's eyes went straight to his wife, like the child was furniture. Leo took one small step backward, then another, until he was standing directly behind my leg, both arms wrapped around it, face pressed against my knee. He did not know this man. 4 years old, and his father was a stranger to him, because a stranger is exactly what Elliot had chosen to be. I felt something harden in my chest. Quiet. Final. Serena moved toward Elliot. Her grief dissolved like it had never existed, because it hadn't. She reached for his arm. He covered her hand with his. 200 people watched in stunned silence as the widow and the dead man reunited at the altar of his own funeral.
Then she looked at me over his shoulder. "Please," she mouthed, "just go. I'll explain everything." I looked at her for a moment. Then I reached into my jacket. I did not shout. I did not make a scene. I simply walked to the front pew where Elliot's father, the Hargrove patriarch, the elderly man who had grabbed the pew to stay upright, was sitting with his hand pressed flat against his chest. I placed the documents in front of him. The email chain, the attorney memo, the phase plan in Serena's handwriting. I said, quietly, "Before anyone decides what happens to this child, I think his grandfather deserves to see these." The old man looked down at the papers. He read the first page, then the second. His face did not change expression, but his hand, the one pressed to his chest, curled slowly into a fist. Serena's voice came from behind me, sharp, urgent. "Ethan!" I turned back to Leo. He was still holding my leg, still looking up at me with those wide, serious eyes that had never once asked me for anything I wasn't willing to give. "Are we going home?" he asked. I picked him up. I held him against my shoulder, and for the first time since those doors had opened, I felt completely calm. Because whatever happened next, whatever legal storm was about to break over that room, I had done the one thing that needed doing. I had made sure the right person knew the truth. The room is about to implode. Subscribe, because what the grandfather does next changes everything. The Hargrove patriarch's name was Gerald. I learned that later. In the moment, he was simply the old man in the gray suit who sat in that front pew for a long time after everyone else had started moving. Lawyers making calls, guests murmuring toward the exits, Serena's voice rising somewhere behind me in a register I had never heard from her before. Gerald sat still and read every page of every document I had placed in front of him. Twice. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and made 3 phone calls in the church parking lot while his driver held an umbrella over his head in the October rain. Elliot was taken into federal custody 72 hours later. I was not there for that. I was back in my apartment, the small 1-bedroom in Wicker Park I had kept paying rent on through all 8 months at the estate, half out of practicality, half out of some instinct I'd never been able to fully explain. I sat at my drafting table and listened to the city and did not feel the way I had expected to feel. I had expected relief. What I felt instead was the specific, hollow quiet that follows the end of something you had not admitted to yourself you wanted. Serena called once, 2 days after the funeral. I let it ring the first time. The second time, I picked up. She did not apologize. I had not expected her to. She said, "I never meant for you to get hurt." Her voice was composed, careful,
The same voice she had used to explain the guardianship form. I listened until she finished. Then I said, "I know. That's exactly the problem." I hung up. Gerald called the following week. His voice was unhurried and precise, the voice of a man who had spent 70 years making decisions and had never once needed to raise it to be heard. He told me that Leo was staying with a family services coordinator while the custody proceedings began. He told me that Leo had cried for 2 days and then stopped eating. He told me that the coordinator had tried every approved method of comfort available to her. Then he paused. "My grandson asks for you," he said, "by name, every morning." I did not respond immediately. I looked across my apartment at my drafting table, at the blueprints rolled and stacked in the corner, at the ordinary, manageable life I had built out of nothing and could return to completely if I chose to. Then I looked at the crayon drawing I had taken from the estate wall and placed on my desk without entirely meaning to. The stick figure, the arrow, the word "daddy" written in the large, unsteady letters of a child who had learned to spell it because he had someone specific in mind. Gerald let the silence sit without filling it. That was how I knew he understood exactly what he was asking. "What would it involve?" I said finally. "Showing up," he said. "That is all it has ever involved." I showed up. Not because the law required it, not because Gerald Hargrove asked me to, not because I had nowhere else to be or nothing else to return to. I showed up because I had spent 29 years watching people calculate the cost of staying and decide it was too high. And I had promised myself, in the wordless way you promise yourself things when you are 8 years old and nobody is coming, that I would never be that person. That when it counted, I would stay. It counted. The family services office was on the 3rd floor of a building on West Madison that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and old coffee. The waiting area had plastic chairs in 4 colors and the small table in the corner with picture books stacked in an uneven tower. A fish tank with 3 fish in it sat against the far wall. 2 of the fish were orange. One was just trying its best. I signed the paperwork Gerald's legal team had prepared. Court-appointed guardian, pending full custody adjudication. Temporary, conditional, renewable. The coordinator walked me through every clause in a careful, professional voice. The kind of voice that has explained difficult things to people in difficult situations enough times to know that patience is the only thing that actually helps. I listened. I initialed where she pointed. My hand was steady. Then she opened the door to the children's room. Leo was sitting in a small chair at a low table, both hands wrapped around a juice box, wearing a blue sweater and 2 different colored socks, one red, one yellow, in the specific way that children dress themselves when they have been allowed to choose and have chosen based entirely on their own internal logic. He was looking at the table. He had the concentrated stillness of a child who has been told to wait and is trying very hard to be good at it. He looked up. For 1 second, he simply stared at me, as if making absolutely certain I was real and not something his tired, hopeful mind had constructed to get him through another afternoon. Then he was off the chair and across the room, and his arms were around my neck, and he was not saying anything, just holding on with the total, uncomplicated conviction of someone who had decided a long time ago that I was the person he was holding on for. I held him back, just as tight, just as certain. Serena was in a courtroom across the city. Elliot was in federal custody. The Hargrove estate was frozen, the empire fractured.
The careful architecture of lies that had held everything together finally settling into rubble. None of that was in the room with us. None of it touched us. I sat down on the floor of that family services office with a 4-year-old on my lap and his juice box in my hand, and one red sock and one yellow sock dangling off the edge of my knee. And I felt something I had not felt in 29 years of being nobody's first choice. I felt chosen. Not used, not convenient, not a phase in someone else's plan. Chosen. She had used me. He had needed me. And somewhere in the space between those two unbridgeable things, I had found the only version of family I had ever actually wanted. Imperfect, unguaranteed, arrived at through betrayal and loss and a locked room and a white coffin that held nothing but air. It was not the life I had planned. But then again, I had never been very good at planning for the things that turned out to matter. Leo fell asleep against my shoulder 20 minutes later, juice box still in hand, red sock dangling. I did not move. I just sat there in that plastic chair in that carpet cleaner-scented room while the afternoon light came through the window and the fish tank hummed quietly against the wall. And for the first time in a very long time, I had nowhere else I needed to be. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. There are more people like Ethan out there. More stories that deserve to be told.